And the Fed! Government is too big! I'm not being represented! Constant screams from the Tea Party, libertarians and Ron Paulers. Jefferson and Jackson both hated and ended the central banks and wanted small government, as did all the founding fathers. The Boston Tea Party was all about taxes. Open and shut case, right? Well, no. History is a bit more complicated than that. Sadly, it's undermined as a weaker and less important field of research, but it is very true that a nation that does not know its history is doomed to repeat it, and people that do know their history are doomed to helplessly watch it repeat. As Stephen Hawking said, the enemy of knowledge is not ignorance, but the illusion of knowledge. First off, not all the founding fathers agreed on the central bank. Jefferson and many hated the central bank thanks to the Bank of England and its impact on their currency, the colonial. Hamilton had ties to the central bank, and Washington and Adams and many others approved of the first central bank that had a 20-year charter. The founders had very diverse ideas on the subject. They also had diverse views on religion, slavery, and unity. Jefferson preferred to have a confederacy of states, while many pushed for a strong central government like Washington, Adams, and Madison, who wrote the Federalist Papers, pushing the idea of a strong national government. Of course, people who don't like these founders' ideas belittle them as not real founders. Even the most anti-big government proponents did not hate big state governments, they were just against big federal governments. Thomas Paine was all for welfare, and he and Jefferson were both huge proponents of government-provided education. History is conveniently cherry-picked by the people framing the debate for the Tea Party. History is severely complex and multi-layered, and parts can be ignored, and other parts can be highlighted depending on who finds what parts important for their cause. However, one of the most glaring and ignored parts of history by the Tea Party was that of the purpose of the Boston Tea Party. They don't even know what their name stands for. They think simplistically that it was just that they were being taxed without being represented. That was a part of it, but not the full story. Let's go back to Great Britain. In the 17th century, the East India Company was formed. Over time, it became a huge money-making enterprise and became very powerful and began buying members of parliament. Several colony governments in the U.S. were founded and controlled by these chartered companies. Coming from the land of no opportunity to a land of opportunity where the printing press was well established, the people began reading and learning about their rights as British citizens, which they considered themselves. The corporations, however, began treating the colonists as second-class citizens, and as colonies became more and more wealthy, the king and parliament saw the colonies as great piggy banks for taxes, especially since they were fueled and owned by corporate interests, allowing them to do as they liked. The final culmination in discontent occurred when the Tea Act was passed by Parliament and the East India Company, creating a monopoly through the East India Company that only sold taxed tea. Being taxed without a vote or any form of representation in Parliament was un-British and a breach of their rights as Englishmen, and the Sons of Liberty dressed as Indians and tossed the tea into the river. Makes you wonder why the Tea Partiers didn't dress up like Indians instead. Under the new American government, corporations were very regulated and very tiny, only allowed to trade in one variety of good by state charter, very complicated, and required to be passed by the state Congress, and only allowed to keep their licenses for a few years, requiring renewal and review. The founders so feared corporations and monopolies that these laws did not change until the end of the 1800s. The corporate laws were more about protecting the people as opposed to helping the companies make money. Tea Partiers, libertarians, and Ron Paulers know about Jefferson's and Jackson's attacks on the central bank, mostly because there are varying opinions on the ethics of controlling banking, as U.S. banks were not corporations like they are now and weren't able to get too big to fail. The founders' fear of corporations are not well known by the American people. It was so ingrained in the minds of early Americans that there was no major action that can be pointed to about how our founders saved America from evil corporations the way Jefferson and Jackson defeated the central bank. America was pretty much a DIY individualist living system for its first 100 years. There was no reason not to. The land we took from the natives provided everything we needed. The only change in living came from new trades with new areas. America had the smallest income disparity in the world and ensured everyone had the chance to succeed with fairly equal opportunity and playing field. Then came the Industrial Revolution, which made things more complicated. Instead of selling one item, industry requires you to build a large infrastructure, and it's not worth building the infrastructure if you can't use it for multiple things. This reduced risk-taking in people until they found ways around it. After the Civil War, some of the laws became relaxed. Andrew Carnegie used a limited partnership in a steel company, which allowed joint liability from many limited partners, filling the same roles as shareholders, while people like Rockefeller with Standard Oil streamlined the use of trusts. Industries created monopolistic trusts by entrusting their shares to a board of trustees in exchange for shares of equal value, with dividend rights. These boards could then enforce a monopoly. However, trusts were used in this case because a corporation could not own other companies' stock and thereby became a holding company without a special act of the legislature. Holding companies were used after the restriction on owning other companies' shares was lifted. Very quickly, these new companies got big and started buying up politicians and lobbyists, allowing them to deregulate. The government, at the last minute, and after a lot of political upheaval, including company towns, stores, and union busting, finally felt forced to step in and gradually reduce the plutocracy. Antitrust laws, such as the Sherman Act, were passed by Benjamin Harrison to reduce the monopoly problem, and other laws later by Teddy Roosevelt, but every time the companies were able to weaken the power of the laws. Ever since they gained a foothold in America in the late 1800s, they have been just like how Jackson considered the banking system a many-headed hydra. The government either can't catch up or they are owned by these companies. Teddy Roosevelt said the government has a duty to regulate corporations because they wouldn't exist without government protection from personal bankruptcy of the owner. In an anarcho-capitalist system, this law wouldn't exist. Corporation is defined by Chief Justice Marshall in 1819 as a corporation is an artificial being, invisible, intangible, and existing only in contemplation of the law. Both the Roosevelts and other presidents reversed the long-standing precedent of government intervention in the free market because of the reversal of the long-standing precedent of the status of corporations. They had to. Unions were being busted, which weren't needed before, against individual employers. Workers' rights basically didn't exist, which, if you didn't like how you were treated by one employee, you could just quit and work for someone else. But now if a company held a large swath of the jobs in the land, you could either work, move away, or quit and starve, assuming you didn't owe your soul to the company's store. Monopolies were put in place, people were becoming dependent on infrastructure of big cities, and then didn't have farmland to fall back on like they used to. Ever since the Industrial Revolution, there have been fights between companies and the people. The companies have spent money on campaigns that the little groups haven't been able to afford to sway the public with. The environment, aka the health of the local people from waste, soot, and pollution, basically went by the wayside. The Hudson River was toxic and Lake Erie caught on fire. Big money has the time and resources to spend on tough battles against tiny plaintiffs. They can spend tons on lobbyists and campaigns. It's a world where the amount of money you have equals the amount of sway you have in legal, political, and tax areas. If money is free speech, then poverty is silence. Corporations today, especially banks, are bigger and more influential than ever. Environmental groups and unions have always been the underdogs as they don't have the money to spread misinformation to break up enthusiasm for activism. Corporations were able to confuse and misdirect people on the dangers of smoking, toxic chemical dumping, and now climate change. Progressive laws and taxes are essential to protect and give equal footing to the average citizen if you want to keep corporations, and it helps make healthier, happier, and better educated workers when done correctly. It also helps businesses thrive as there's more money to buy things, creating a consumerist economy never heard of in the world until post-World War II. It is your prerogative if you believe in laissez-faire capitalism. You can be an anti-statist or a polystatist or an anarcho-capitalist, but do not for a second claim to believe you have anything in common with the Founding Fathers. A co-op is the only thing they would have agreed with, and potentially well-regulated one at that. The founders loved small business so long as they stayed small, as they didn't become too powerful. But after a certain size, they became a menace to the people by way of using the government and laws to their advantage in ways an individual or small business never could. Well-regulated capitalism is still the most efficient at distributing goods and services in our modern technological era, but because of the power it has, it is much like playing with fire. George Washington considered the government a fire that should remain small and controlled, but necessary and useful, while corporations were to him and people of his kind a ruthless forest fire that couldn't ever be controlled no matter what, and shouldn't even be attempted. So if you're a Tea Partier and wanting to play dress up, you really can't in all honesty wear a tri-corner hat, unless you are planning on wearing a red coat at the same time to defend the interest of big business.